Reconstructionists offer discourses and interventions as forms of social practice. Okay, so discourses as forms of social practice that transform whiteness, and therefore white people, into something other than an oppressive ideology and identity. Reconstruction suggests rehabilitating whiteness by re-signifying it through the creation of alternative discourse. So that's where you might get the phrase anti-racist whites. It projects hope onto whiteness by creating new racial subjects out of white people, which are not necessarily ensnared by racist logic. On the other hand, white abolitionism is guided by Roediger's famous phrase that whiteness is not only false and oppressive, it is nothing but false and oppressive. Now you might ask yourself, what does that mean? Does that mean I'm only false and oppressive if I'm white? Okay? So I'm distinguishing between things like whiteness, white people, and white bodies. So right off the bat, if whiteness is only false and oppressive, it's to be distinguished from white people. Okay? Because whiteness in this suggestion is an ideology. It's a position and a choice-making part of one's life. So to the extent that you don't have to be white to make your decisions out of whiteness. So whiteness is an ideology, a perspective, a worldview, a decision-making process, i.e. whiteness is a choice. Okay? So in opposition to reconstructing whiteness, abolishing whiteness sees no redeeming aspects of whiteness, and as long as white people think that they are white, James Baldwin once opined that there is no hope for them. Okay? Now, neo-abolitionists argue that whiteness is the center of the race problem. As long as whites and whiteness exists, little racial progress will be made. Furthermore, the investment in whiteness, the wonderful phrase we get from George Lipsitz, is the strongest form of investment because it is the most privileged racial identification. And as long as whites invest in whiteness, the existence of the non-white races will also continue. So that's one premise of the study of whiteness, is that it is the strongest, most crucial form of racial investment. Now, the clarion call for abolitionists asks whites to disidentify with whiteness, leading to the eventual abolition of whiteness. I would also add, in the literature you might notice, and I added to this in The Souls of White Folk, that this abolition of whiteness wasn't exactly equated with the abolition of white people. But to my understanding, if you sort of undercut the category of whiteness, which the identity of white people depends on, you are in effect undercutting the concept of white people. And so my recent understanding is that to abolish whiteness is to abolish white people. Okay? Now that's different from white bodies, right? White bodies will still exist, but we will no longer consider them white people. I'll get into this a little more. But I'm trying to distinguish between whiteness, an ideology, white people, an identity, and white bodies, which is some kind of literal understanding there that then we graft the meaning of white people onto, right? But if you undercut whiteness as an ideology, one that a lot of the abolitionists suggest is parasitic, right? And it's an ideology that white people really depend on. But if we give white people an option out of that, and it's not just sort of words, right? It's sort of structural transformations. Then what I'm suggesting is that it also signals the withering away of white people. So one is not born white by virtue of having a white body. One has to be taught to be white. And there are many signals both in our home and in our schools of how whites are taught as young children to be white. And usually that means in opposition to the non-white, usually black. Okay? So white, according to Ignatieff and people like Roediger, is kind of a very negative identity and negative signifier, to the extent that it is only what it is not, and what it tries to suppress and repress, which is the other. Okay. Now, it might seem strange to you that white folks may find this quite controversial to suggest not being white anymore. It's ironic and controversial because in a colorblind era, white folks already don't buy into their whiteness. So why would it be so unsettling to suggest to white folks that you not be white anymore when most white folks go through daily life assuming they're not white anyway? right?
Let's go to what it really is then. When we talk about the power of melanated people, when we talk about who we really are as guys, and understanding that our melanin is so powerful and it connects us in a way that the reason why they fear black, the reason why they fear is because the lack that they have of it. So then when you see what Dr. Francis C. Welsing talked about is that fear in that
just genetic annihilation,
deficiency of when you have a person that has the lack of pigment, the lack of melanin, that they know that they will be annihilated. So therefore, however they got the power, they have the lack of compassion. That melanin comes with compassion. Melanin comes with soul. That we call it soul. We soul brothers and sisters. That's the melanin that connects us. So the people that don't have it are a little, and I'm gonna say this carefully, are a little less, and where the term actually comes from, because I'm bringing it all the way back around to Minister Farrakhan, to where they may not have the compassion or the when they were sent to the mountains of Caucasus, when they didn't have the power of the sun, that the sun then started to deteriorate them. So then they're acting out of fear, they're acting out of low self-esteem, they're acting out of a deficiency. So therefore, the only way that they can act is evil. The only way they have to rob, steal, rape, kill, and
fight or flight,
in order to survive.
Exactly.
So then these people who didn't have what we had, and when I say we, I speak of the melanated people.
Right.
They had to be savages. They had to be barbaric. Because they're in these Nordic mountains. They're in these rough, torrential environments. So they're acting as animals.
Right.
So they're the ones that are actually closer to animals. They're the ones that are actually the true savages. And then they built up such this I don't want to say warrior, but they built up such this conquering barbaric mentality.
White Reconstructionists would argue with this disappearance of whiteness. Okay, they would rather recover it, and the disagreement falls within two domains: theory and viability. Okay, theoretically, Reconstructionists do not agree with Roediger's maxim, right? That whiteness is only false and oppressive because there are many examples of whites, such as the first abolitionists, and including the neo-abolitionists, I would call them, who have fought against racism. Reconstructionists argue that whites can be remade, revisioned, and resignified, more importantly, and are not hopelessly and merely racist. Their search is for a re-articulated form of whiteness that reclaims its identity for racial justice. They acknowledge that whiteness is a privilege, but that whites can use this privilege for purposes of racial justice and therefore contribute to the remaking of whiteness that is not inherently oppressive and false. So it's about rehabilitating, resignifying, re-articulating, unthinking, remaking, etc. Reconstructionists also have a sort of viability question, which is they consider this strategy as more viable than arguing for the abolition of whiteness, a discourse that I already mentioned, that most whites will probably have a difficult time accepting. The discourse of white abolition will only lead to white defensiveness and retrenchment and does not represent much hope for even progressive or anti-racist whites. To the Reconstructionists, abolitionism is tantamount to promoting a certain self-hatred, shame, and guilt among whites. The question still remains, what to do with whiteness is my question for today. So some concepts that I'm already focusing on are whiteness, white people, white bodies. How do whites enter into a racial discourse, a racial struggle, and what is their place within it? Because that's what the whiteness studies folks are asking us. So there's this real concern about what to do with our white students and white young people. And you might ask, what's this self-indulgence in whiteness studies that asks the questions of, forget about you, now let's talk about me. A lot of how it comes across to Kinchlow and Steinberg is that whites have to forget their whiteness. And that they have to buy into blackness, they have to buy into alterity in order to sort of join the struggle. But they're looking for a space where whites can be white and enter the struggle as reformed or transformed whites. Whites are women, men, gay, lesbian, etc. And so this complexification then prevents us from sort of essentializing whites as only and hopelessly oppressive and racist, because they are at the matrix of relations of domination, but also can be on the receiving end due to multiple identities. Okay? Sort of practice and political viability of Reconstructionism that Tischl and Steinberg are talking about. You might want to question the idea that, just because people feel defensive about something doesn't mean that it won't work. Right? Men are defensive about patriarchy. That doesn't mean that we don't attack it, right? And so that's the question here is, just because something offends or, offends one's sensibility doesn't mean that it won't work or that it isn't the preferred route. So it is hard to imagine that a mass movement of whites are going to buy into the notion that you abolish your whiteness. But that never suggested that anything important was going to be easy. Okay? So the abolitionists would like to take this up. So they're asking us to dissolve the white race. Okay? And they're asking whites particularly to ask certain questions about, is it worth it to be white anymore? Right? They're really challenging the Reconstructionists by this passage. Right? They're asking, is what you're saying merely a discursive strategy because we don't find any examples of positive iterations of whiteness? Now, you may ask yourself, wait a minute, there were abolitionists who were whites, there are people today, there are people in the civil rights movement who are whites. Now, I suppose the way they're making sense of it is that when whites go against racial oppression, they are undoing whiteness and arguably themselves. So not all decisions that whites make, going back to my original point earlier, not all decisions that whites make are within the whiteness as an ideology framework. Right? But when whites make their decisions, and people of color make their decisions, out of whiteness, the results are predictable. We have enslavement, genocide, discrimination, labor market discrimination, segregation. These are all the examples of whiteness that we know as suggested by Ignatius. And there is no example to the contrary. But when whites do make their decisions out of otherness, that's different to them. That's not just whiteness. That's concrete white people making concrete decisions. And those decisions aren't necessarily guided, again, by an ideology of whiteness. Whiteness may be false and oppressive, but there's a space here where we can say that white people are not just false and oppressive. Okay? They can make certain decisions that are guided by something else. So that's a very good question to ask Reconstructionism, is what are the examples? Other than it would be nice, for whites to be anti-racist, it would be nice to re-articulate whiteness. They're asking, show us some examples of where whiteness has been a positive force, not white people.
And if I were to say to you right now, Christopher, what do you like about being white? What would you say?
I don't know. Again, it's such an amorphous term. It's like a census term or a
but can you do me a favor? Indulge me. Indulge me for one. We're running out of time. Indulge me for a minute. I understand you see it as all these things, but you surely recognize that the world sees you as white. The world reads you as white. And if you were to ask me some things I like about being black, I could talk about cultural norms, I could talk about tradition, I could talk about the kind of commonalities I feel around the diaspora. If I were to ask you particularly if you're saying whiteness is a thing that is being constructed as negative and shouldn't be, name something positive that you like about being white.
Well, sure. I'll answer with a thing. There's a lot of documents that are floating around public schools that say things like timeliness, showing up on time, is a white supremacist value or a white value, white dominant value. Things like rationality, things like the Enlightenment, things like objectivity. And these are very strange things to be ascribed to a racial identity. My view is that these are actually should be ascribed to every individual human being. Every individual human being, regardless of whatever racial category we impose on them.
Well, Christopher, that doesn't answer the question, though. You're telling me you're making straw men about things that are ascribed to whiteness that you think are wrongfully ascribed to whiteness. I'm saying if whiteness isn't a negative thing, and there's something that that whiteness actually shouldn't be constructed as all negative, name something positive about that you believe is positive about being white.
Again, I don't buy into the framework that the world can be reduced into these metaphysical categories of whiteness and blackness. I think that's wrong. I think we should look at people as individuals. I think we should celebrate different people's accomplishments. And again, I think the idea, you mentioned Ignatieff. Ignatieff says the goal is to, quote, abolish the white race. In any other context, this would be interpreted as a near genocidal slur. I don't buy into it. The reason I'm not going to answer your question is I reject that categorization. I think of myself as an individual human being with my own capabilities, and I would hope that we could both judge each other as individuals and come to common values on that basis.
Fair enough. I would argue, though, that the ability to say, I don't see race, I don't recognize or own whiteness is an extraordinarily white thing to be able to do. It's an exercise of power and privilege. You can ignore the label of whiteness and still be able to enjoy all the spoils of whiteness.
I think what annoys me most about white people is when they pretend like they're the victim. What's also annoying is when they kill us.
What is fragile about whiteness when everything has been constructed around it?
Every part of who I am has been distorted or criminalized.
It's really just a bunch of white lies.
One of the definitions of American whiteness is ignorance.
White people, we are not your problem. You are.
Should white people today feel any responsibility for slavery?
Hell yeah.
This is a wild place, y'all. It's a wild place. I know Harriet and Frederick be up there just like, what is they gonna do?
When I do a caucus group or something and the white people are afraid I might think they're racist, I think you're racist. I do. I think I am too. Right? White progressives can be the most difficult for people of color. White progressives do indeed uphold and perpetrate racism. When I first applied to be that diversity trainer back in the early 90s, I thought, well, of course I'm qualified to lead discussions on racism. I'm a vegetarian. And let me just say that, I love Seattle, and everything I learned about white fragility, I learned here working with white progressives. And this, of course, is the first thing that tends to trigger white fragility, generalizing about white people. I know white people really well. I don't actually think young people today are less racist. In fact, they're getting worse. So I'm just gonna put it right out here. As a result of being born and raised as a white person in this culture, I have a racist worldview. I have deep racist biases. I have developed racist patterns.
U.S. taxpayers contribute $1 billion a year to fund the Smithsonian institutions. $33 million of that goes towards the National Museum of African American History and Culture, a stunning building that opened in 2016 devoted to the story of Black history in America. They recently launched a tool they say is aimed at talking about race. In it, you'll find packets of information, videos, handbooks, and a page called Whiteness that has now disappeared from the website in a graphic that was titled this, Aspects and Assumptions of Whiteness and White Culture in the United States, which says this, among other things. The individual is the primary unit, self-reliance. Wife is a homemaker and subordinate to the husband. Christianity is the norm. If you didn't meet your goals, you didn't work hard enough. Hard work is the key to success. And last but not least, under aesthetics, it says steak and potatoes, bland is best. Here now, Mark Thiessen, American Enterprise Institute scholar, and Richard Fowler, senior fellow at the New Leaders Council. Both are Fox News contributors. First of all, I just want to say I'm glad that they took this down, because that obviously means that they recognized how awful this thing came across. Richard, what are your thoughts when you see that? I mean, what were they thinking?
Listen, I can't speak for that graphic, but I think when you read the entirety of the tool, which I spent some today working through and reading through, I think there's some very interesting things on there that's really important to talk about. And I think one of those things that's really important is talking about and engaging in the conversation as a country around white privilege and what it actually means. And the tool talks about what white privilege means, and it defines it as an inherent advantage possessed by a group of white individuals because of the historics, the history in the United States, and the bias of the history of racism and bias, not an individual person, right? Because I can't assess somebody's racial animus, nor can.
But I mean, can you
neither
imagine,
you.
Richard, if someone took, you know, other races and tried to say, these are the things that they look like and sound like, and here's how you'll know when you find someone like this, because this is the kind of stuff that they think and believe. I mean, that is unbelievable. And honestly, I saw lots of that kind of tone as I went through this, and I find it really, it's offensive.
No, I agree with you. And sadly, far too often for African Americans, that's their lived experience. Just take black women, for example. When black women go into the hospital, for whatever the reason, maybe it's because of how they look, maybe it's because of how people judge their threshold of pain, they're 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related illnesses. And if they have a college degree, Martha, they're 5.2 times more likely to die than their white counterparts. And I think that's sort of
I understand that, and I know that. I mean,
along.
that's a terrible statistic, and that's something that should be changed. I want to bring Mark in here with your thoughts on this as you looked at this. Mark, what do you think?
I mean, nobody's denying that racism exists and it's a terrible thing and that we should all unite to fight it. But this document, and especially this graphic, this was designed for children. This was designed to teach children about whiteness, and it's insipid. Quite frankly, it's a racist document. It basically says that objective rational thinking, the nuclear family, hard work, self-reliance, politeness, and delayed gratification are white characteristics. That it's racist to say that black people don't possess these characteristics, or that it's alien to black people to have these characteristics. This document, if you showed this document to David Duke, he would endorse every word in it. This is what white supremacists have been preaching for years. You know, and it's so to have the Museum of African American History, which is a great institution,
it is a great institution,
put this out, which is basically white supremacist rhetoric in the guise of anti-racism, is a horrific thing to do.
You know, I always go back to this quote by Martin Luther King, who's also, you know, obviously depicted and explained in the history of his life in this museum as well, who said that, you know, we strive for the day when we don't talk about white power and black power. We talk about human power and God's power. And I was raised to believe that we are all equal, that this is the greatest melting pot in the experiment of the world, and that we are all here together to share this country, that we're Americans first. And that's what I find so missing from all the dialogue that is in here.
Can I say something about that,
Yeah,
Martha?
go ahead, Mark, and then Richard.
This document is a rejection of Martin Luther King's vision. So Martin Luther King, when he gave his I Have a Dream speech, he said that my dream is rooted in the American dream, which is defined by the characteristics that they say here are white characteristics: self-reliance, hard work. He said, my dream is that my children and grandchildren will be judged by the content of the character, not the color of their skin.
Let me give Richard a chance to respond
here are white.
Yeah.
Before I run out of time,
listen, I mean, I'm not saying that this graphic was the best graphic, but I think the entirety of the tool speaks to the work that we've. No, the entirety of the tool speaks to what we've got to do as a country, because I think you're right, Mark, that hard work should pay off. But sadly, and far too often for people of color, hard work in this country still has them behind the lines in inequitable situations. Just like I pointed out to women of color who have babies, who are 5.2 times more likely to die at childbirth.
All right, Richard.
We agree 100%.
Richard, thank you very much for being here tonight. And Mark Thiessen, thank you very much for being here tonight. Always good to see you both.
So, I mean, they're committed, Ignatieff and Garvey are committed particularly to this notion that if given these options in a realistic way, whites would choose, I think what they're saying is the moral choice here. But it has to be in some ways convenient, because currently it's very inconvenient for whites to argue for abolition because of its contradictions. And what will whites be afterwards? We can perhaps talk about that in our discussion. What will it mean to be post-white? Again, to pose the question, what does it mean for the conceptual death of whiteness and for the death of white people? Okay. A lot of you may read the post-literature, you know, the posties as I call them, and it's very common to talk about the death of the subject. What does it mean to talk about the death of the white subject? So, just to pose for our discussion, what does it mean to be after whiteness and after the quote-unquote race transformation or revolution? What will whites be? What will other people of color, that is, what will we be? And what does that mean for sort of an educational process to bring children up for this possibility?
Like white power is Trump Tower. Like these things are put against each other, but when we say we want to kill whitey, we don't really mean we want to kill whitey. We do. But when we say we want to kill whitey, it's like it's a capitalist, not today.
Finish the show.